All the major milestones in ballooning are owned by the French. The invention, first sheep flight, first duck flight, first rooster flight, first manned flight, first balloon accident, first balloon death. Fittingly, a Frenchman with an unpronounceable name was the first to strap meteorological instruments to balloons, then let go. This was as complicated as ozone measurement got until the Dobson meter, which sounds like a gadget James Bond might use if Q was from Yorkshire, but is actually a device that measures ozone from the ground. Balloons remained the meteorological vehicle of choice until the late 50s, when someone had the idea of strapping instruments to a satellite, and in turn, strapping the satellite to the top of a rocket. In 1970, NASA launched Nimbus-4, which was equipped with a new experimental device called backscatter ultraviolet. This would monitor the total amount of atmospheric ozone and its vertical distribution on a global scale. It began to relay some odd numbers back to Earth. Very low total ozone values were being reported over Antarctica, lower than anywhere else on the globe, and no one had any idea if they were caused by the satellite going full HAL 9000 Skynet or by some real geophysical effect. Meanwhile, Claire Patterson probably had no idea that an hour's drive from his Caltech office in Pasadena, two other men were also trying to get to the bottom of Thomas Midgley's work. Sherwood Rowland, a chemistry professor, and Mario Molina, a postdoctoral researcher, were, in 1973, conducting a study at UCI to try to understand what happened to CFCs once they were in the atmosphere. It was based on computer modelling and thus purely hypothetical, but the results were worrying. It showed that, in theory, CFCs could destroy the ozone in the stratosphere. Ozone is like oxygen's quirky cousin with a superfluous nipple. Each molecule has 3 atoms instead of the usual 2. It makes up just 0.00006% of the atmosphere, and its usefulness depends on its location. If it's in the troposphere, it's a pollutant that damages plants, is nasty to breathe, and is a crucial ingredient of smog. If it's in the stratosphere, it protects all life on Earth from the sun's UV radiation. Ozone also stinks. Like chlorine, apparently. This is ironic because chlorine obliterates ozone when it gets into the stratosphere, which it does thanks to chlorofluorocarbons. What happens is this. I'm sorry. I won't do that again. Basically, when UV radiation breaks down CFC molecules, chlorine is released. Chlorine is an elemental pickpocket and steals one of ozone's 3 oxygen atoms to form chlorine monoxide while leaving a regular oxygen molecule behind. Chlorine monoxide also reacts with ozone, releasing 2 regular oxygen molecules and freeing chlorine to continue its devastation. In this way, a single kilogram of CFCs can obliterate 70,000 kilos of ozone. Their preposterous ability to destroy is only matched by their longevity. CFC-11 has an atmospheric lifetime of 60 years, CFC-12 120 years. CFC-114 will be up there for 2 centuries. As if that wasn't enough, these are super greenhouse gases, thousands of times more efficient at trapping heat in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. Rowland and Molina decided to publish and presented their findings to the American Chemical Society in 1974. The aerosol industry did not like that. By December of that year, the first of a spate of congressional hearings on the possible threat posed by CFCs to the ozone layer occurred. The aerosol industry didn't like that either. Robert Abplanalp, whose name sounds like a large brick falling into a small pond, liked it less than anyone. In the late 1940s, he invented an aerosol valve, which revolutionized the industry, made him a fortune, and made his company, the creatively named Precision Valve Corporation, the biggest name in valves. He defended his company exactly how you'd expect someone who was close friends with Richard Nixon to defend his company. Abplanalp claimed that free enterprise was at stake by equating the defense of aerosols with a broader defense of capitalism and, by extension, America and American values. By 1975, DuPont was running full-page newspaper advertisements stating, "Should reputable evidence show that some CFCs cause a health hazard through a depletion of the ozone layer, we are prepared to stop production of the offending compounds." It was an argument that was now 50 years old and had more mileage than all of Keith Richards' internal organs combined. When the National Academy of Sciences published their study into the validity of the ozone depletion theory in September 1976, the conclusion was dire. It seemed inevitable that CFCs would break down in the stratosphere, and at 1973 emission levels, deplete global ozone by 7% in a matter of decades. Within months, the regulations which would ban CFCs in nearly all US aerosols were adopted. The situation should have been made clearer with the launch of the new and improved Nimbus-7 Satellite in 1978, which included a cutting-edge version of backscatter ultraviolet called a Total Ozone Mapping Spectrometer, or TOMS. The satellite worked flawlessly. The software used to analyze the data from it was a disaster. The galaxy brains at NASA hadn't programmed it to flag readings that deviated wildly from expected values. This proved to be a costly oversight. Further regulation of CFC use in refrigeration, air conditioning and manufacturing was proposed by the EPA in October 1980. Then Jimmy Carter lost the election to Ronald Reagan. Reagan immediately declared that government wasn't the solution, it was the problem, and just like that, the environmentalism of the 60s and 70s was replaced with the dumpster fire of regulations that was the 1980s. Two things averted the potential catastrophe of a reversal on CFC regulation. They both happened a few months apart. Just for a minute, I need you to imagine one of the most important little motes of UV radiation ever ejected by the sun. Let's call it Gary, because, well, there's a shortage of Garys. Gary popped into existence sometime in early 1985 and spent a genuinely riveting 8 minutes and 20 seconds travelling towards the Earth. Ordinarily, upon reaching the atmosphere, Gary and his UV pals would be harmlessly absorbed by the ozone layer. But this wasn't an ordinary atmosphere. This was an atmosphere that had over 1 million tons of CFCs being spaffed into it annually. Gary's journey had been made somewhat easier, but that wouldn't have mattered to him had he the sentience to understand his predicament. Gary was special. Gary was going all the way through the stratosphere, through the troposphere, towards ground level near the Potomac River, bouncing off a glass of orange blossom special, through the papillary dermis on the nose of a 74-year-old man from Illinois, and irreparably damaging his DNA, resulting in basal cell carcinoma. Gary had just partly saved the ozone layer. A few months later, in May 1985, 3 meteorologists working at the British Antarctic Survey published a paper reporting a substantial decrease in the total ozone column over Halley Base Station. When NASA reviewed their TOMS data, they realised that because ozone depletion had been so severe, the software they were using couldn't see it. That August, at the International Association of Meteorology and Atmospheric Physics conference in Prague, the first map of the Antarctic ozone hole produced from the TOMS satellite data was unveiled. It showed that the decrease in total ozone wasn't just a local phenomenon over Halley Bay. It spanned the whole continent. When the New York Times published these pictures on the 7th of November 1985, they couldn't be ignored. The ramifications were immense, and policymakers around the globe collectively shat themselves. There would be huge increases in cataracts, non-melanoma and malignant melanoma skin cancers, detrimental effects on plant life's physiological and developmental processes, and potentially catastrophic effects on marine ecosystems and biogeochemical cycles. If something wasn't done, the world would become a giant Florida. The horror. The unmitigated horror. In 1987, the Montreal Protocol was ratified to phase out the production of various ozone-depleting substances, including CFCs. It became the first treaty to be universally adopted in UN history, and stands as a testament to how swiftly and decisively the world can act when there's the political will to do so. One of the key players behind it was US President Ronald Reagan, who just months after the Halley Bay findings were published, had the dangers of a world with the trashed ozone layer highlighted to him via a diagnosis of basal cell carcinoma on the schnoz. Thanks, Gary. At its greatest extent on the 9th of September 2000, the hole in the ozone layer was 29.9 million square kilometers. That's an area the size of the United States, Canada, and China combined, while still short by a full United Kingdom and New Zealand. But don't worry, In the 2 decades since, that number has fallen to a measly 20 million square kilometers, or Argentina, Kazakhstan, Algeria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Greenland, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, Afghanistan and Estonia combined. Scientists expect the whole to shrink to the size it was in 1980 by the year 2070. Great news if you bought shares in the sunscreen industry. On Midgley's first day at Delco, he found the entrance to the converted tobacco warehouse, which served as catering's headquarters, locked. After manfully wrestling with the door for a while, the lurch-like figure of catering appeared and informed him that it wasn't a real door. It was a fake placed there for aesthetics. The actual door was around the side. The perfect metaphor. Midgley's modus operandi was finding side doors while his peers were grappling with an unyielding entrance. His refusal to believe in the impossible is one of the things which made him special. His proclivity for unintended consequences was the other. One invention turned environmental disaster is unfortunate. 2 is almost funny. It isn't difficult to imagine that Midgley went to work every morning with the sincerely held belief that he and his colleagues were making the world a better place. This isn't always the case. There are people out there right now, acquaintances of mine, who put their trousers on in the morning and try, with every screed of energy within them, to make the world worse. Usually for money, but in rare cases just because they can. This doesn't exonerate Midgley. The day William McSweeney died in a straitjacket, Standard Oil, the operator of the Bayway plant at which he worked, held a press conference. Midgley was in attendance, and when a reporter asked him if it was dangerous to get any of this new additive on the skin, asked for some to be brought out. He poured tetraethyl lead over his hands and held the beaker to his nose for over a minute. When the demonstration was finished, he added, "I'm not taking any chance whatever, nor would I take any chance doing that every day." For reasons too obvious to bother pointing out, he failed to mention his recuperative jaunt to Florida. Had Midgley been afforded the luxury of our 2020 hindsight, I'm sure he would have been horrified by the magnitude of the problems his life's work caused. He may have put lead in gasoline and CFCs in the atmosphere, but big business, acquiescing governments, and sycophantic handmaidens like Robert Kehoe kept them there. So why, here you ask? This is all in the past. Leaded petrol and CFCs are banned. Not exactly. Leaded petrol was still available in Afghanistan, Algeria, Iraq, Myanmar, North Korea, and Yemen as recently as 2017. Tetraethyl lead is still added to the aviation fuel used by propeller planes, the global consumption of which was around 1.3 billion litres in 2016. The Montreal Protocol and its numerous amendments allowed the developing world to continue producing CFCs and halons into the 2010s. In 2018, China was caught using CFC-11 in polyurethane insulation. It sounds trifling until you hear the numbers. The equivalent of 35 million extra tons of CO2 annually, the same as London's yearly emissions. So here we find ourselves, still using CFCs and tetraethyl lead nearly a century after their invention, and many decades since we discovered how environmentally disastrous they are, staring down the barrel of climate change and hoping against all reason that the same legislative processes, governmental systems, and economic models which allowed industry to keep using such compounds will somehow miracle up a solution to a problem as enormous, complicated, and urgent as global warming. The main thrust of the arguments against the regulation of leaded gasoline and CFCs were that it was genuinely churlish of any regulatory body to require change until it could be proved conclusively that the air was poisonous and a fundamental safeguard under which life evolved was being destroyed. It was Marx who said that history repeats itself, first as tragedy, then as farce. If history repeats itself in the 21st century, we're unlikely to see it as the latter.
Carbon footprint. You can't use hairspray because hairspray is going to affect the ozone. I'm trying to figure out, let's see, I'm in my room in New York City and I want to put a little spray so that